audience members, and panelists. We are Team Cranium from Leadership Initiative's Advanced Medical Neuroscience Summit. Today, we'll be presenting how the limbic prefrontal networks mediate the relationship between childhood trauma and functional neurological disorders. My name is Kushal Kotapalli.
I'm Andrew Schwab.
I'm Caitlin Chan.
And I'm Veena Ganti.
And our final person, Alina Peric, is unfortunately not here presenting with us today.
So unfortunately, both aspects of our research are very prevalent in today's society, which contributes to our drive to research further and help eliminate all the unknown and stigma surrounding these topics. As you can see from the visuals, both childhood trauma and functional neurological disorder, which is also known as conversion disorder, are both extremely prevalent and both log highly dangerous numbers.
So specifically, our group wants to focus on the role of the limbic prefrontal networks in mediating the relationship between childhood trauma and functional neurological discrepancies in cognitive functions.
So what exactly is functional neurological disorder? So FND impairs the functioning of the nervous system and how the brain and body send and or receive signals. FND is a multi-network disorder involving abnormalities within and across brain circuits implicated in motor, sensory, and cognitive functions.
Now, there are many reasons to understand the relationship between trauma and FND. In a study that was, in one of the studies, it was stated that both neurologists and psychiatrists report feeling ill-equipped caring for patients with FND and lack an updated conceptual model for this condition. So simply, physicians and patients have a very limited understanding of the pathophysiology of FND. Now, by taking this understanding of trauma and FND, we can actually improve how cognitive and behavioral therapy programs are actually set to address the effects of FND. In another piece of literature, it was stated that 41% of adults reported symptoms of anxiety and or depressive disorder. And these symptoms actually correlate with trauma, making it even more prevalent and even more essential to understand the relationship between trauma and FND. Next, we can also destigmatize functional neurological disorder in the healthcare field. Many patients and physicians specifically misdiagnose FND. And lastly, we can improve individual treatment plans because this is where medicine is already heading.
All right, let's talk about some background research. So let's essentially figure out what we're looking at here. So we're gonna be focusing on the prefrontal cortex, which contains the anterior cingulate cortex responsible for body orientation and movement execution. We're gonna be focusing on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher cognitive functions, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotional and motivational functions, as well as the amygdala, which processes emotions and memories associated with fear. So what's the impact of FND and the trauma on the brain? So the age, frequency, and degree of traumatic experiences cause damage to the cognitive function of the brain, like working memory. This damage could worsen if continued across multiple developmental stages of childhood. Adolescents who are exposed to trauma activate other regions of the brain, other than the amygdala and the PFC for emotion regulation. With decrease in function, patients have a decrease in working memory, flexible thinking, and self-control. If these parts are impaired, then then we pose a question as what are the parts of the brain that are going to be activated during this time? Brain damage to the orbital frontal and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, PFC, and dorsal medial prefrontal cortex impairs the ability of decision-making, processing of facial expressions of emotion, and task performance. FND shaped by childhood trauma can influence limbic and cognitive control areas, diminish capacity for consciously managing recollections of events, and instill fear in a child when recollecting these traumatic experiences. And finally, in children linked with trauma, we found that smaller PFC volume has been found to be connected with hypoactive medial prefrontal cortex activation during cognitive evaluations, as well as hyperactive amygdala activation during emotional and demanding tasks.
So let's move on to what is already known. So childhood maltreatment is associated with a host of neurocognitive consequences, such as low academic performance and deficits in attention, inhibitory control, and emotion and reward processing. Secondly, modern neuroimaging technology has revealed smaller volumes in several brain regions in individuals who were exposed to childhood maltreatment relative to unexposed comparison subjects. This was predominantly shown in the frontal and limbic regions of the brain. We found multiple studies that linked childhood trauma to decreased gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, and from there, we were able to find studies that linked decreased gray matter in the prefrontal cortex to increased impulsivity and decreased attention. The official cause of FND is still listed as unknown, but there is a growing body of evidence that does link FND to childhood trauma. And now moving on to what is unknown. So it's unknown how the effects of childhood trauma continue to affect an individual throughout their adult lives, as well as how the effects of this trauma are found through FND and how it affects the prefrontal cortex. Lastly, if the parts of the brain are impaired, what are the structural differences and how does it differ in the way that a patient thinks? I will now be passing it along to Veena, who will discuss our hypotheses.
So now we're going to look at the sub-question 1. How does imaging the prefrontal cortex in adults who had childhood trauma compare to adults who did not experience any childhood trauma? From this sub-question, we hypothesize that the prefrontal cortex in adults with trauma will be structurally smaller and have decreased functionality along with hyperresponsivity of the amygdala compared to adults who did not experience any trauma.
And so moving on to sub-question 2, what is the relation between the trail-making test and the prefrontal cortex? So we hypothesize that the neurophysiological effects of individuals with trauma will impair the executive function of individuals with FND and will demonstrate reduced prefrontal cortex activity as demonstrated through this test.
Now let's move on to the proposed methods of this project. Before we move on to the procedures, let's first talk about the different test descriptions that we're going to be using. First test we're going to be using is the ACEs test, also known as Adverse Childhood Experiences. This provides a relationship between the adverse childhood experiences and adult health and social outcomes. Furthermore, it provides a quantitative result for the amount of trauma one faced on a scale from 0 to 10. The higher the number, the more amount of trauma. 3 subject areas which the ACEs test focuses on is abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Now let's switch to the trail-making test. Trail-making test can provide us information about visual search speed, scanning, speed of processing, mental flexibility, and as well as what we're focusing on, the executive functioning. It consists of 2 parts in which the subject is instructed to connect a set of 25 dots as quickly as possible while still maintaining. The reason why we're using both of these tests is childhood trauma could be subjective. The ACEs test allows us to put a quantitative result to it so that the subjectivity is reduced. Secondly, the trail-making test provides us an accurate test to measure the executive functioning between individuals who do not have FND and who do have FND. Now let's move on to the procedure. So first, we're going to start off with 2 large groups with 2,500 adult patients. One group is going to be affected from FND. The other group will have no existing neurological conditions. Stating this, both groups are going to take the ACEs test. The ACEs test will provide us data from 0 to 10. We're only looking at patients who have a score of 0, meaning no childhood trauma, and individuals who had a score of 5 or greater, meaning they had accelerated childhood trauma. After this, we're going to separate ourselves into 4 groups. We're going to have 3 control groups, 1 control group and 3 experimental groups. After that, we're going to gather quantitative data to the trail-making test, whilst gathering qualitative data to an fMRI. The TMT data will be used to assess executive functioning, while the fMRI results will depict a neurophysiological difference between each testing group. This slide shows us a procedural diagram, so I'll just highlight some of the key spots. In the beginning, we can see how much patients we started off with. All these patients will take the ACEs test. After that, they'll be separated into 4 groups, 1 control and 3 experimental. The control group is individuals with no FND and no childhood trauma, while the experimental groups are no FND and childhood trauma, FND and no childhood trauma, FND and childhood trauma. All of these groups are going to be taking the trail making test and the functional fMRI test. After all of the results are in, we're going to compare the quantitative and qualitative results between the control and experimental groups. These are some of
as I mentioned before, we will have to take our sample size and actually divide it into 4 different groups. And these groups are differentiated based on their ACEs score, whether it's high or low, or whether the individual has FND or not. So as you can see right here, the first 3 groups, we expect for these groups to have a high average TMT score. And this is due to abnormalities of either the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex. However, for our control group, just group 4, we expect for this group to have average TMT scores because they don't have any abnormalities with the amygdala or the prefrontal cortex.
Our proposed study contains many steps for the test subjects to complete. We would need to allocate times for our many patients to complete these steps, like the fMRI, ACE test, and trail making test. Finding participants that fall into each of our separate categories might be challenging, especially since functional neurological disorder is a fairly rare disease. Some of our participants could have high levels of childhood trauma. This study could potentially bring that trauma back up into their lives and could lead to mental illnesses like depression and anxiety. We're not sure if different types of trauma cause different results, since the ACE test simply provides a number and not the type of trauma. Participants that indicated that they had no childhood trauma, fMRI results could vary if they experienced trauma or other stressors at a later age. And finally, this study doesn't address the impacts of poverty or racism, which could cause differing results. Some say that our research is only focused on one executive function, whereas FND affects many executive functions. However, the lack of attention, which is the executive function we studied, also is affected by childhood trauma. So it's easier to find a correlation with something that affects both conditions or experiences. Also, some might say that there's not much research done on individuals with FND, which makes finding a specific function of the prefrontal cortex that it affects much harder. However, the purpose of our study is to confirm with data that there is a correlation of trauma and FND, and a follow-up study can be conducted to understand the specifics.
So I'll now be moving on to discuss the ethical, legal, and social implications that come along with our research. So on the ethical side, patients will be asked to recall traumatic events from their past, which can bring up harmful memories that participants may have already put behind them. Also, the ACEs test quantifies someone's trauma. It's possible someone may feel invalidated by this numerical evaluation. Though we will be conducting this test, it's important that we let patients know that we see them and their experiences as more than just data. On the legal side, it's possible for someone to use the results of our trial in a court of law. They could claim they have damaged the limbic system and try for a reduced sentence, especially if they have FND and/or childhood trauma. Now on to social implications. We want to avoid putting labels on people, especially ones that have negative connotations. And finally, patients with FND are often stigmatized by physicians since there's still so many unknowns surrounding this disorder. These are our sources, and we'd like to thank all of you for your time, and we're now open for any questions.
Okay, guys, so you go ahead and stop sharing your screen. Morgan, you can now go ahead and start, and I will bring up the panelists.
All right, congratulations, you guys. That was fantastic. I love the depth of all of your information, how professional you were. You handled all of that so well. So congratulations. Terrific job. You should feel very, very proud of yourselves. And I know you were the last group to go, but I'm certainly glad that we finished it off on such a great note. So really well done. Feel very proud. And as the panelists join, I will pass it along to Dr. G.
And hey, team, thanks for hanging in there and being the last group. I know that there's sort of an interesting balance between let's watch some other groups go and modify our style to, oh my gosh, I'm getting more and more nervous as the other groups go. So props and kudos to you on hanging in there. Very interesting study. Und Herr Professor Kohls, wirklich, das ist direkt und genauso deine Sandbox. Bitte, spring rein.
Well, yes, I'll do immediately. Well, that was the last presentation, and I have to congratulate. I have to congratulate you. It was a long day for me. It's appearing to be a long night, but this was brilliant, and I think it is timely. It is needed, and FND is clearly a topic that is becoming more and more important as we understand what the long-term consequences are. I would particularly address one question that came to my mind when I heard you talking about the ethical, legal, and social implications. And first of all, I learned in grad school, every time you recollect a memory, you change it. And given that this might actually happen here too, and I think that's what we have to assume and presume. Couldn't it be the case that given that we are using technology to sort of monitor what's going on, that will actually leave a larger impact on the way the memory is actually changed, be it to the better or to the worse? And then if these studies that you suggested will be more conducted, might it not be the case that, and I mean, you raised the point, so I would like just to follow up on that, because clearly you have given some thoughts on that people will use it as an explanation for changing their sentence, and in case of criminal acts and so on. And how could that be tackled? And if possible, how could you reduce or even avoid that?
Team, what do you think?
So I'll speak on the ethical implications. So I did find multiple studies where patients who have gone through trials like this did say that though it was a hard experience, in the long run, they experienced positive effects from being able to look back on their trauma and gain some insight on it. And also the ACEs test allows for it to be kind of more numerical instead of having to replay through each event individually. It's more so, did this happen or did it not happen?
Very good. I like the answer. But let me just add another perspective to it. As you have heard, I'm pretty much into health promotion. And one of the concepts we are actually very interested in is post-traumatic growth. So the positive outcome as a consequence of bad memories, bad experience, whatever. And could you think of any way so as to pitch what you have in mind in a way that people are supported in producing what the literature has come to know as a post-traumatic growth?
So if I understood your question correctly, you're asking if, could you repeat your question again? Sorry, I couldn't.
I'm just wondering whether you could actually help with a sort of pitching the setup in a certain way to help produce people overcome that trauma in a better way, so as to produce what we have come to know as a positive post-traumatic growth.
I think it's definitely possible, especially because people who experience these traumatic events may feel alone and isolated. Being in this trial and seeing that there's other people who went through similar things, as well as just the data that comes from the research in general, can show that there is a physical cause for these feelings and there is reason behind functional neurological disorder.
That is very good. So would you actually consider letting patients talk to each other and let them sort of compare their results and let them talk about what has happened? Or is it something that should be avoided at all costs?
I'll answer that question. So looking at our study, we're not the result is only just to the childhood trauma factors just to play a part in how the effect is on FND. So as long as the patient is okay with sharing their experiences and trying to grow from their experiences with other patients, we don't find that as any flaw.
Okay.
I'd like to add that I think it's important that patients talk to each other after the trial is conducted, because if they talk before, we wouldn't want anyone to have any certain implications that would affect their answers to our ACEs test.
Okay, cool. Your answers clearly show that you have given this a huge amount of thought. I can only applaud your efforts. Very good.
And Nico, speaking of applauding efforts, thank you for hanging in there. We know it's very late in Coburg, and I know that you have Rettungswagendienst that you have to do or have done. And so thank you very much for contributing your subject matter expertise to the development of our scholars. As you know, it's always a pleasure working with you. So feel free.
It's great fun, and it is actually, I have to say that the overall level of the presentations I have seen is outstanding. So the pleasure is on my side.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. Dr. Wertzman, this also falls squarely in your wheelhouse in the sandbox. Please.
Yes, excellent job. I really appreciated the way that you defended your choices, that you set things up. You explained why you were choosing to do certain methods over others. You linked the different explanatory levels. I know that we had talked a lot about that, and you made a very good effort at linking those throughout the presentation and throughout your experimental design. And I very much think that as other teams have talked about with ACEs and childhood trauma being truly a public health issue, it is interesting to connect that as within an organic cause for functional neurological disorders, because one of the characteristics of functional neurological disorders is they don't fit into any pattern of organic actual disease, right? So if you're expecting a particular reflex to be absent or present, if this symptom is there, it'll show up like a healthy person. So one of the hypotheses is that it's really a top-down kind of a consciousness-mediated system down to level to the cellular and circuit level, down into these areas kind of a function. And so what I think is particularly brilliant about your approach is that you are addressing executive function, which is really a complex global function. You're picking one, you picked a test, and I had coached you to find a more specific test. I didn't know which one you were actually going to choose in the end. I thought this was a great choice given what's known about emotional salience network potential abnormalities with functional neurological disorders. It isn't a common, it both is and isn't a common disorder. I know several people who have functional seizures, for instance, that are not epileptic. One of them is a therapist. Some of them have trauma, some of them do not. But by and large, the more severe conversion disorders, as you know, are linked with traumatic experiences. But there's also something about the psychogenesis of these disorders and their responsivity in some ways to complementary and alternative medicine, even far more so than others, that really suggest that something going on here. I just think that as a topic, studying these is an interesting way to link the unexplained mechanisms of some of those types of treatments and the similarly sort of top-down consciousness phenomenon that seems to be the locus of abnormality in functional neurological disorders. You guys intuitively made those connections. You designed an experiment that probes it, that makes a really good start. And I just think this was an excellent, excellent effort on your part.
Yeah, I certainly can't disagree with that at all. I mean, and let me just second it. And I think one of the things that Dr. Wertzman brings to the fore is, well, how do you treat something that is exceedingly top-down that may also be very, very difficult to isolate, particularly in the absence of childhood trauma, right? And or if the childhood trauma was cryptic or the individual is non-divulgent in regards to childhood trauma, it's too painful. And this is at that interesting interface between what represents psychiatry, psychology, what represents neurology, and also what represents neuroethics. And let me give you an example of why that is so. We have a mutual colleague whose name is Professor Karen Rommelfanger. And a number of years ago, Professor Rommelfanger wrote a very interesting hypothesis paper as to whether or not the true value of placebo-type interventions should be against functional neurological disorders. In other words, does the treatment sort of meet the disorder? If the disorder was due to some sort of psychogenic effect, might a psychogenic intervention might then be effective in creating this post-traumatic growth and therefore allow the individual to top down cure or mitigate the effect. And that brings us squarely into the camp of what I would consider to be a new neuroethics. And as soon as we begin to talk about a viability of neuroethics for these new perspectives on neurological and or psychiatric disorders, you're right in Professor Shook's sandbox. John, over to you, my friend. Don't forget to unmute your mic. There you go.
Thanks again for an excellent project. The whole FND, it sort of, the term kind of almost came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And my first pragmatist reaction as a pragmatist philosopher was, oh no, here we go again, another dichotomy. And you're going to get these in psychology, you get them in philosophy. You don't really want them in neurology because you don't see them in biology. Tell me the strict difference between the function of a leaf on a tree and the structure of the leaf on a tree. Just tell me two completely different stories where the structure has nothing to do with the function and the function has nothing to do with the structure of a leaf. Well, if you assume that that's your methodology, you will learn nothing about a leaf. You will learn nothing about the brain if you dichotomize function and structure. What the dichotomy actually has to do with a frustration of a lack of knowledge of what the brain is doing. All structuring is functioning, all functioning is structuring. The brain is not a static, architectured, pre-engineered thing. It's a living biological system, and you guys know that. You designed a study to overcome, whether you intended to or not, I'm all excited methodologically, to overcome that. And there's a huge ethics payoff, and Dr. Giordano gestured at this. If you can overcome this, you can show that history matters. Individual, personal, lived history matters. What we are right now is what we have undergone in the past and how we have attempted, poorly or well, to adapt to it. We are adaptive creatures, and you're trying to tell part of that story of maladaptation, which functionally, right, you can tell a story of that, but it's also a structural adaptation to extraordinary stresses in life histories. So you're overcoming the dichotomy. I think this is methodologically sound. You know, there are hurdles to any study design, but I think that the reason why you're straddling neurology on the one hand and psychiatry on the other, as Dr. Giordano was mentioning, is precisely because you're studying one organic living system, and people undergo their experiences in a very lived, animated, and very vocal fashion. And your study is able to take into account the full lived human experience. And I think that's ethical. So I get excited about that. It's ethical research design, fitting a real ethical need out there. So congratulations.
Yeah. Ms. Thompson.
Last but not least, you guys get bonus points for going last, just like the first group got bonus points for going first. So kudos for hanging in there. I'm approaching this obviously from a completely non-scientific standpoint. I'm intrigued by this concept of trauma. When you defined trauma and you gave sort of the breakdown of the elements of what would go into the ACE assessment, I think it would have been helpful for me to have that earlier in the presentation. I want to be clear on what you were considering trauma. And I'll give you an example. Most of my examples draw on my own personal experience. I grew up in a military family. I moved about every year to 2 years. Someone said to me once, "I'm so sorry you had such a dysfunctional childhood." I thought, It wasn't dysfunctional. I had a mommy and daddy who loved me, and you know, we moved a lot, but I had a great childhood. But somebody else's perception of that was that this must have been traumatic for me, and it really wasn't. Or there might be somebody who, say, has a phobia of something, who has an event that is very traumatic for them, but might not be traumatic to anyone else who doesn't have that phobia. So when you're doing this ACEs assessment, and I'm not familiar with the test itself, but if you're just asking, do you have these specific experiences, just to dig deeper and find out, were those specific experiences traumatic to that person? Some of them are obvious. You've got physical abuse going on, not a question. But there's one listed in there as divorce, for example. Was that traumatic for the child? Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a good thing. Maybe it was a great development. Maybe they got a wonderful step parent out of a remarriage or something. So I'd just be interested to understand how you're defining and how you're measuring and comparing childhood trauma. And then the next question I had was, what about trauma later in life? You're asking about these childhood experiences, so I presume that your test subjects are all adults. What if they had events in their lives happening in their 20s or 30s that they would consider traumatic? Would you do a separate study for that or compare them? I'd just be interested to see where that goes. From a presentation perspective, I thought you were very professional. But Kushal, I think you have a future as a documentary TV host. Just a couple of things on the presentation itself. Really, this is going to sound like I'm nitpicking, and I don't want to end on a negative note, but spell check. And your sources should be listed alphabetically. That's really picking it nits. But I found this topic really interesting, really fascinating. And I think one of the reasons was because there were so many shades of gray here. And I'm not a scientist. I love the fuzzy gray stuff in the middle. So good job. And again, kudos for going last.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much for sharing all of your feedback. Did anyone